I once took a class from a Sufi master in Berkeley. He arrived on time for the workshop, introduced himself, then promptly invited all of us to get up, walk outside to the sidewalk, and look at some flowers. We knew right away this would not be an ordinary class. We stood there in silence for a long time. You actually have a picture up of those actual flowers. He said something I've never forgotten. He said, if I were being true to my tradition, we would spend our entire 3 hours that were allotted together simply standing here on the sidewalk, taking in the beauty of these blossoms. And you would learn everything you needed to know about Sufism. But actually, that's probably not what his sponsor had in mind when they hired him to teach the workshop. So he actually did give us a lesson about Sufism. And as I was preparing to be with you today to preach about silence, it occurred to me how odd it is to spend all this time crafting words to throw at you. But then again, standing up here silently for 20 minutes is probably not what the worship committee had in mind when they invited me. I could safely say that I've been seeking silence my whole life, seeking the way that someone searches for a spiritual strength. Not the looking you do when you're looking for a new pair of shoes, but true seeking for a connection with the mystery. Throughout the first 2 decades of my life, I went to Catholic Mass every weekend with my whole family. The church resembled a modern cathedral. The capacity was about 1,000. There were 20-foot gold statues of each of the apostles behind the altar, very elaborate. But I remember my favorite part was after all of the scripture, after the sermon, after the Eucharist, finally, the priest was up on the altar and would just sit still and close his eyes, and we all shared a few minutes of silence together. Something very powerful happened for me in that time, and it almost always brought me to tears. It felt like the truest part of the Mass, and it also felt like it did not last long enough. It seemed to me that if the purpose of going to Mass was to strengthen my bond with God, to enrich my spiritual life, then surely that silence should have been longer. I eagerly awaited it and regretted when it ended. After college, I had the opportunity to visit a Quaker meeting. I went in Philadelphia to the Arch Street Meeting House, built in 1804. And the rustic room we met in lacked all the grandeur of my family's church. It was furnished with solid white walls, no adornment, hard wooden benches facing each other. No clergy member led the service at all. Mostly we just sat in silence. And whatever words were there seemed to arise spontaneously from those present, unplanned. And inexplicably, we all went somewhere together. I don't know quite where that was, but it was as though we were all dwelling in some kind of a thick mist. And when it left, we all knew at once, wordlessly, that the meeting was over. And I thought it was magic. I knew I had found my spiritual home. Ten years ago, I was here at Live Oak as a member. I was a student at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. I lived in a very nice house in a planned community in Goleta. I had worked very hard to get this house. I had put all of my savings into it and then borrowed some more money from family, kind of an American dream kind of house. But I was often bothered by the noise in the neighborhood. And it wasn't terribly noisy. It was one of those peaceful tracts in Goleta. It was just the sounds of other people living their lives. But I realized that living there, I felt disconnected from nature. I started to wonder if perhaps my life would be better if my living situation somehow drew me closer to nature. And I had the opportunity in 2006 to 07 to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I looked for a place there that was very rural, and I found it. It was a house on a couple acres, and it had a large wooden deck out back, and as you looked up, there was a canopy of tall redwood trees. And I spent hours there underneath that canopy doing qigong and just looking and listening. And better than that, there was an 11,000 acre county park contiguous to the property. So I could leave my door on foot and be out walking in the wilderness. And just like when I first tasted Quakerism, I was hooked. So when I returned to Goleta, I searched for a more rural home. And I found one on 200 acres, a room for rent on a 200-acre ranch on the Gaviota Coast with panoramic views of the mountains and the ocean. And this was my home for 7 years. In the beginning, I was thrilled to be there, but I was also very anxious about the remoteness. I thought around every corner there must be a bear ready to eat me. And perhaps worse than that was the bugs on the ground. The small ones probably terrified me more than the big ones. But I'll never forget the first night that I spent alone on that ranch, where I knew that for 200 acres in all directions there were no other people. And I ask you to contemplate, when in your life have you been the furthest from the next human being? Now, if you're a solo backpacker, this is no big deal. But for those of us who grew up in suburbia and have always been in cities or suburbs, or perhaps on a group going camping, it's quite a thing to really feel that there's miles between me and the next human being. It was a very big experience. I experienced a very deep silence and a powerful sense of connection to nature. And this was what I knew I had been looking for my whole life. One of the people who studies silence for a living is Gordon Hempton. He goes by the moniker of acoustic ecologist. I think he invented that. I don't think there's more than one. He collects recordings of things like dawn breaking on a prairie, thunder, or the sound of wind in tall grass. Can't you just hear that? If you think about it, he's capturing that with his microphones. He's on a quest to find places where one can have a noise-free interval during daylight hours for 15 minutes. He scours the United States looking for these places. And how many places do you imagine there are? He says there are only 12 left in the United States. Hempton calls silence the think tank of the soul. The think tank of the soul. He defines quiet not as an absence of sound, but rather as an absence of noise. And specifically noise generated by human activity. Because even in the most silent wildernesses, there is the sound of the natural world. He feels that if we are in touch with the natural acoustic system, we're okay. But when we spend too much time in human-made sounds is when we run into trouble. I've come to understand that the sounds and sights of a neighborhood are somehow an anchor for the psyche. Other people living their lives nearby cradles us. It kind of gives us the message, you are here. You're constantly oriented. And when we're in wilderness or when we're in total silence, we lack these anchors. We lack distractions to protect us from our inner voices. At these times, our fears and anxieties can seem larger than life. But I would contend that the very things that arise when we are in silence are guideposts to the next step of progress in our spiritual lives. Things we prefer not to think about, thoughts we can suppress when we're busy, are important messengers. I liken them to those little piles of rocks you find when you're following an indistinct hiking trail, the cairns or ducks they go by. The very fact that we can no longer insulate ourselves from their effect when in silence is the very reason that we need the silence. There is a still small voice within each of us that can only be heard when we take time for silence. It may be our own inner wisdom speaking to us. It may be our own neuroses speaking to us too, but I think if you let the neuroses float up and out and release it, there is something underneath that's very significant. So we can have very many active spiritual practices that improve the well-being of our bodies and our minds and our spirits. But if we do not welcome silence now and then, I believe we're missing out on something really valuable. And when you think about it, all of the world's major faith traditions incorporate silence somehow as part of their practice. We can go back to the Upanishads from 500 to 800 BC when they were written down for this quotation. When the five senses and the mind are still, and reason itself rests in silence, then begins the path supreme. 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote, "Distraction is the only thing that consoles us for our miseries, and yet it is itself the greatest of our miseries." I mentioned how ironic it seemed that I should give you all these words in order to explain the terrain of silence. And in fact, there are very many spiritual leaders, teachers, who lead from total silence. This is rather puzzling when you think about it. I can understand a monk, a person, a hermit, specifically choosing to develop their own inner life by being sequestered and alone and not communicating. But a teacher, and if you think about it, you may know of some of these teachers as well. One is Meher Baba, to whom the Meher Mount in Ojai is dedicated. He did not speak for 43 years. For the first 2 years, he did write with pen and paper without speaking orally. For 27 years, he communicated only by pointing to letters on an alphabet board. So he obviously had to have an economy of words in what his messages were. And the final 15 years of his life, he communicated only with hand and facial gestures. And he was a magnificent, powerful spiritual teacher. So I guess someday, if I evolve far enough, I will come and just stand here silently and gesture at you. I came across a small book recently that's written by two local authors, Mary Ellen Kelly and David Coombs. Some of you may know of it. They are messages that they received in dreams and in waking states from ancestors, and they say this about silence. "The most profound of all sounds is that of silence. Not the silence that is absence of noise, but that of the quietness in which we hear the longings of our heart and ponder our response." And that begins to get at, for me, what it was that was happening in the Catholic Mass after communion. I'd previously been praying my intentions while the host melted in my mouth, but when things got quiet, my deeper longings bubbled up to the surface. These were leanings that I simply could not sense amid distractions. They could only reach me in silence. The author of our centering thought in the order of service today, Gunilla Norris, writes, "Silence is that vast field of permission and sustenance in which our lives are held." She adds that throughout the years, she has found that beneath whatever we might think our discontent is, we very much need three things: an awareness of our inner longing, the courage to act on behalf of that longing, and a sense of community to support and maintain our inner journey. And when I read that last sentence, I thought, well, how fortunate all the members of Live Oak are to have a community right here that supports and maintains your interior journey in such a beautiful way. So I'd like to share with you some practical steps for actions you can take to bring more silence into your life as a spiritual practice. We'll start with the most demanding and then kind of gradually go to the most easily accessible. Of course, one can start with a complete silent retreat, and living in California, there are many places to do that. The Vipassana Center in North Fork is probably the most famous, a place to go for a 10-day silent retreat. And they don't charge a fee. You can't say, oh, that's too expensive. The time might be costly and hard to arrange your life, but they don't charge anything for it. If you would prefer to try to do a silent retreat close to home, there's the Center for Spiritual Renewal at La Casa de Maria. They will feed you, they will house you. All you have to do is be there and be in stillness. You can eat your meals in stillness as well. You can also do a silent retreat at home. This is something that I like to try to do, emphasis on the try because I don't always make it, but try to do once a month, even if it's only until noon. And just do this. Let people know you're not going to be checking emails or voicemails, and you're not going to be speaking until noon the following day. And from the time you wake up, my rules are I may not accomplish anything. That's a hard one for me. No talking, no texting, no television, no emails, no internet searches. I do journal write, and I do read if it's something that contributes to my contemplative time. But just to have that time and to see what emerges. I think most of us, if we try, really could carve out a morning to do that, say until noon, and then you can resume your day. There's a new phrase that has emerged called the digital detox. And I found this online. There's a woman named Crunchy Betty, and she runs a blog and a Facebook page, so she's wired all the time. It has something to do with food and creating natural face masks or something like that. But one day she posted this image, and she said, I'm just going to take 3 days off from digital communications in order to connect with the people and the world around me. Okay, so this is different from going away alone to a retreat center. This is staying home with your housemates, with your loved ones, and having the retreat together. And without the digital communication, you actually are focusing on the people who are right in front of your face. Maybe you have time to cook together, maybe you have time to hike together, things you might not have otherwise done. She added no video games, no emails, no text messages. She must have young ones in her house. She said, if this is too hard for you, because apparently she got a lot of emails back from people saying, oh, 3 days, I couldn't possibly, that you could set a certain time like noon and 6 p.m. each day that you will check for messages, but you'll only respond to things that are true emergencies. So I invite you to schedule a digital detox in your life. You can practice mindfulness meditation. How fortunate you are to have right here at Live Oak, the Live Oak Sangha, every Tuesday night, and I know there's many other activities that go on, but the silent meditation, walking meditation, and discussion that happens right here at Live Oak. You can even just take 5 to 10 minutes of silence each day. Gordon Hempton, the acoustic ecologist, said he does this every morning. Now, he must have very acute hearing, because he says sometimes he has to go to the master breaker in his house and turn it off to make sure there's really no sound being generated mechanically in his house. But he starts with 5 minutes. You might have to get up a little earlier than your housemates, but I think it will be worth it, even if it's only occasionally, to take a few minutes of silence before you start your day. You could write a love letter to silence. You could tell silence you've missed it, that you'd like to start over, that you'd like to form a relationship again. Give it a try and see what happens. And lastly, if you must remain busy all the time, I suggest that you experiment with single tasking. This is in contrast to multitasking. This means doing one thing at a time. And lately, my favorite time to practice this is while I'm driving. Not talking on the cell phone, even though I'm legal because I'm hands-free. Not trying to get down the latest chapter of the book I'm listening to on tape. Not even listening to the radio. It's enough just to drive for those minutes. Let that stillness enter. It's surprisingly revolutionary. So those are my tips. And to complete the story of my search for silence, I want you to know in the sequence of where I've lived that I recently purchased a cabin off Paradise Road in the Los Padres National Forest. So rather than renting, I have a home of my own. And the picture you have now is the picture of the view out the front door. Planes do sometimes fly overhead during the day, so technically it would not qualify for Gordon Hempton's list of the last great quiet places. However, to me, it truly is paradise. It qualifies as my own square inch of silence. So that silence is always available to me. I still need to choose to dwell in it, but it's there, and I suggest you do the same. It doesn't cost anything, and it just might be the most important spiritual practice you undertake. At certain moments, silence speaks volumes. At life's beginning, as we wait for the first cry from the mouth of a baby who has just left the womb, the cry that confirms that her lungs have made that transition from taking in amniotic fluid to taking in oxygen. And likewise, at the end of our lives, we keep a vigil at the bedside of one who is actively dying. And reflexively, we start watching that breath, anticipating the moment when the chest fails to heave and a deep and final silence replaces it. My hope for myself and for all of you is that in between these two pivotal moments of birth and death, quiet will always be available to you, and you'll get plenty of practice at delving deeply into your own silence and finding the treasure that is buried there.